Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Great Decisions series, and we're delighted to have you. Let me make sure we get this right. There we go. So welcome. Of course, it's Tuesday. Of course, we just had a big dump of snow, which is very exciting. And I hope you're all out there and enjoying it as much as you can. So today, of course, Great Decisions on Thursday. We're going to go to Mexico. We're going to hear from Mike V. Hill, who's just an extraordinary speaker about all things related to drug trafficking. We also have an expert on weapons and weapons movement from the United States to Mexico, and money laundering to complete our trifecta of some of the dark issues that can happen at the border. Next week, we have 3 streams. Of course, Tuesday, we're going back to Great Decisions, and we're going to get into China's role in Africa with Ambassador Marcus Quino, who has a lot to say about it. It's such an interesting issue. On Wednesday, we have a special presentation alongside the Phoenix Council on Foreign Relations and the Malikian Center at Arizona State University. This is the first part of our Russia disruption series, where we're going to look at assassination at home and abroad. And we'll look at Novichok, we'll look at Navalny, we'll look at the opposition within Russia at the moment through a journalist, Yevgenia Albats, who's about to head back to Russia, where she's the CEO of the New Times, an opposition paper in Moscow. We'll hear from Sean Walker, who's with The Guardian, was the Moscow correspondent for many years for them, and also from Paul Colby, who is a former CIA agent or operative, or I always get the words wrong, and is now at the Belfer Center at Harvard. It's going to be a really interesting panel. Then on Thursday of next week, we're about to promote, it's about local journalism, and we'll feature a number of different folks from around New Mexico who have lots of interesting things to say about collaboration and about really the future of what we all know to be the bulwark of our democracy, in the sense that without local journalism, especially in the state capital, we're in a lot of trouble. So let me now bring in today's speakers. And just before I do so, this is a discussion series. I would love for people to raise their hands. I can unmute you and bring you in. You can add your voice. You can have something to say. Of course, if you'd rather just type into the Q&A box, that is certainly an option. But let's talk, let's discuss, bring your questions, bring your ideas, because we have a couple great folks, as we all know, who can help us talk about them. So let us bring in today's speakers. Welcome to Dr. Todd Greentree, who's joining us, of course, from across the ocean in Jordan. And Todd, of course, is an author, historian, former Foreign Service officer, and has many a story and many a factoid to share about the world. Welcome, Todd. It's great to see you again.
And hi, everyone. Sandy's having a little trouble with his with his connection, so I'll just start talking. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Are we all good? Okay, just to say, I am really happy that Todd's joining me because I kind of feel like this is a difficult kind of format, because there really should be a discussion, and it can't be a discussion unless I hear from you. But fortunately, Todd's going to help me keep this going, so I know it's going to be a great session. I don't know whether you read the section. If you did, congratulations. I thought it was pretty boring. But I don't think globalization is boring. And what we're going to do is go through the 5 questions. And I will read the 5 questions. Todd and I will discuss the 5 questions, and then we're hoping to hear from you as you raise your hand, and then you can speak directly and we can see you. Or if you prefer, you can just put your question into the question and answer. I'm a big fan of globalization. I was kidding Sandy this morning, and I said I don't like this question because it says the growing trends in globalization. And I'm like, hey, globalization started with the United States after World War II. Through the Marshall Plan, when we began to help to rebuild Europe, and then international trade and the United Nations, and then came the law of the sea and trade agreements, the GATT, the World Health Organization, all these things that make our international system work. And then Sandy said, oh, no, it's really been millennia. And isn't that the truth? I mean, since humans walked out of Africa, we've been interconnected and it's only grown. You might say since the first Vasco da Gama went around the Horn of Africa and connected the east to the west, or Marco Polo, the overland route, we've been connected. And globalization doesn't stop just because the United States has a president that says America first. Globalization, in my view, will continue. So before I ask this first question, I'm going to ask Todd to chime in and give his view on globalization.
Well, I'll just add a little bit to what Vicki said. And I think that the point about globalization being a process of millennia, it's part and parcel of human evolution. But oh, by the way, Sandy, I wanted to mention, it's a CIA officer. For the CIA, an agent is a collaborating source who's basically usually betraying their country to provide information to us. Globalization. Let me get at this in a little bit different way than Vicki did. In a definitional sense. So if you read the article, the Great Decisions article, she's going on and on about economics, and that's what we think about is the economic dimension. But in fact, I think it's totally appropriate to talk about the economic dimension as the center of gravity of the process, the process of interaction, of exchange, of integration among peoples, which in the modern era has accelerated enormously. But I would throw a couple of other dimensions into that, and to do that, let me be historical. There are not just economic aspects. There is political globalization. There is cultural globalization. Today, I mean, you can think of climate change and what's associated with that as environmental globalization. So you can apply this label to all these different factors. I would say that our current era of globalization actually began not with economic globalization, but with military globalization, and that was World War II. And it wasn't just after World War II, it was the war itself. This was the Second World War, and it was truly global, fought between the Allied powers and the Axis powers in virtually every country on Earth. The things that you think about globalization, trade, capital flows, supply chains, the newest thing that has become so current, were all very much factors. For example, the Japanese were in the process of regional expansion in Asia when the United States decided to attempt to block that expansion by prohibiting their supplies of petroleum. And that was the precipitating cause of the attack on Pearl Harbor that led to opening that theater in World War II, that in turn brought the United States out in enormous force, unprecedented presence throughout the Pacific, and turned the United States into a truly Asian power. So I mean, we could go on and on about that, but I think that gives you the idea that globalization has multiple dimensions. And then we can pick up what Vicki was saying. It was the post-World War II era that put into place the institutions of globalization that created the ability of free trade, of lower trade barriers, of capital flows, of all the things that we think about in terms of economic globalization to take place. Slowed down a bit during the Cold War because the world was divided into blocks, but picked up again rapidly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Muted, Vicky.
You, Todd. I should know better by now. But I see that we have a question from Stefan Gauper. Remember the ambassador, my friend, the French ambassador, and he says, I would like to ask the following question. According to a press release, President Macron proposed to President Biden to try and solve the dispute between Boeing and Airbus on state subsidies. What do you think are the chances of reaching an agreement? Thank you, Stefan. It's great to hear from you, and thank you for watching. Todd, that's a question for you, not me.
Well, I mean, this gets us right into the sort of the nitty gritty of globalization. One of the dimensions of globalization, of course, is the assumption of free flows of capital and goods, but it does not eliminate the notion of competition and or of government participation through a variety of means in increasing national economic wealth and benefit. So that, I think the Airbus Boeing issue is going to be a perennial of globalization, but it ties to a bigger issue, which is that one of the dimensions of globalization, of course, one of the things that enabled it was the evolution of technology, particularly of aircraft and of civil aviation, which lowered the cost of global travel for everyone, and created enormous opportunities for economic growth among the manufacturers of aircraft. So on that basis, on the basis that globalization relies on the growth orientation of capitalism, the fact of growing markets in a growing economy, growing markets will reduce the zero-sum nature of competition between Boeing and Airbus. So what we're really talking about is competition for growing markets, which creates a very different game. So I would put, I would say, if to the extent that bigger things are at stake, France and the United States will figure out a way to work this out. And one of the ways to do it would be by strengthening the international institutions to regulate trade and investment.
Stefan, that was a great question, but I was thinking of another question that always comes up, and Todd actually mentioned the globalization of culture, and France has always been very determined to keep French as a very important language in all parts of the world. In fact, I would say that the loss of French language in Rwanda, or Rwanda changing from French to English, was a blow. And I also remember the concern about Disneyland and Disney World coming to France because of this kind of spread of English and American culture. And of course, France has always been sort of the leader in culture. I don't know whether you want to comment on that or not, but I think that's really an important part of globalization, the competition between the United States and France, perhaps not even intentionally, over our languages and our cultures. Stefan raised his hand, so Stanley, can you unmute Stefan and see if what we
Yep.
see?
I can. Go ahead, Stefan.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, all right. I'm all right. Well, that's a very good question, Vicky. First, I'm delighted to meet both of you. Regarding the language question, the cultural question, I think the answer is pluralism. What should be avoided, and this is what we think, is that in the dominance of one particular language or one particular culture. You know, I was struck, just to give you an example, I was struck when I visited Helsinki to see that all people in Helsinki speak both Finnish and Swedish, because there's a very large Swedish minority in Helsinki. And obviously they speak English as well. So I see no contradiction between speaking several languages, but one should not abolish or push aside the other. You know, as you know, my wife is Italian, and our kids and grandchildren speak French and Italian fluently, and our kids speak English as well. So I see no contradiction between the two, provided we make sure that each language has a right to be taught and a place. And in the future, I'm quite convinced that the vast majority of, let's say, of mankind will be able to speak and to read and to write in several languages.
We hope so. Thank you, Stefan. Americans are notoriously bad at that, as you know.
Not all of them.
They wonder why people don't speak English.
Your new Secretary of State speaks French like a Frenchman.
Yes, he lived in France, so that's wonderful. Right. Todd, any comment on that?
Just that I agree with that basic thrust of that argument. Globalization does not imply, you know, this is the old Jean-Paul Sartre existentialist issue, is, you know, do people abandon themselves when they take on a new identity? The answer to that is diversity. That globalization implies a facilitation of goods, of capital, but also of ideas, and by extension of the interaction of peoples. So one of the things that facilitates that globalization is a lingua franca. Now, English has evolved to be that global lingua franca, which does not in any way mean that it is going to supplant other languages. And I'd say quite the opposite, to the extent that you know, liberal to be more open and diverse, it means respecting other people to the extent of investing significant amounts of political capital and resources in the reviving of native languages, like we see in New Mexico, where Tewa is actually Tewa speakers are expanding in the current generation. And of course, France's efforts as a nation, but also as a government, to keep French alive has been very successful. So that's my take. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think
Stefan, go ahead.
He just said merci, so I think we can proceed.
I said merci, thank you. I agree.
You're muted, Vicky.
Vicky, muted.
Herb Thomas says, given the depression in civil aviation due to COVID and the reset, on the other hand, to mitigate aviation production of greenhouse gases by developing hydrogen fuels, for example, maybe it would be a good idea for the US and EU to provide large, undisguised subsidies to both Boeing and Airbus. So that's maybe that's how they solve the question. I want to go now to the first question, and we've already touched on it, so we probably won't spend a long time on it. Can any country afford to ignore the growing trends of globalization in favor of isolationist policy? And I would just say the United States just tried that under President Trump. And although he annoyed a lot of our allies, I can't say that I think, and he pulled out of a lot of agreements like the climate change, like the nuclear agreement with Iran, said he was pulling out of WHO. But of course, Biden has rejoined all of these. And so globalization is back in place. For me, I don't think any country can ignore or but can successfully isolate itself in the age of communications, transportation, and the expansion of knowledge. Todd?
So can any country afford? The word afford implies an economic cost. But I'd say that it's across the board. To use the broadest definition of afford, look at the country that is probably the most willfully isolated from the rest of the world today, and it's North Korea. Can North Korea afford to do what they're doing? Yeah, sure. They figured out a way to be, sort of a criminal parasite on the global system, to live by smuggling and reliance on their neighbor China. The reason they afford it is not because they believe they have a better economic model. They do it for national security purposes and to sustain this incredibly perverted regime. So that implies that any country, nation state that wants to move in the direction of autarky in the modern era of globalization will be expressing a pathology, in the sense of perversion of the direction. And that's very much what we see in looking at the Trump administration's behavior. Just to draw a little parallel there, I like to think about these folks as Taliban. The only difference is that they didn't really have any idea what it was they were looking back to. There was no coherent vision, but it was certainly a backward-looking vision of the world. Yeah, we're gonna get coal back online. We're gonna revive the United States as an industrial manufacturer. I mean, there are elements of things that might make sense in some ways. For example, maintaining a disadvantaged labor force. But as a vision for a national direction, I think the only choice is really to look forward and adapt to globalization, and in the case of the United States, take on a leadership role.
And that brings us nicely to the next question, which is essentially, why don't people like globalization? It says, how can globalization be improved so that it can benefit more and more people? What has prevented this in the past? And first of all, again, I have real trouble with this globalization. Maybe I shouldn't have volunteered for it, because what has prevented this in the past? That's crazy. In millions and millions of people are out of poverty because of globalization. In 2019, the lowest percentage of people at any time in history were out of extreme poverty. Extreme poverty at this point only impacts 9.1 to 9.4% of the population. I mean, globalization has done amazing things for the United States and indeed for the entire world. I think the problem is the downsides, or what are the downsides of globalization, pertain more to individual countries. And the United States is the second lowest of developing countries. It's not really lowest, the second least equitable in income of the developed countries. And I think in essence, that's probably the problem for many Americans with globalization. They say, why are you spending this money abroad when it could be when it could be spent on infrastructure, poverty, school programs, education in the United States. Over to you, Todd.
Yeah. Well, I think people fundamentally, misunderstand the concept of comparative advantage. There are so many things to think about that are negative to globalization, like Vicky, like you're saying, the inequities that arrive as a result. But in the United States, it's not a result. It's not the product of globalization. It's the product of internal distribution or maldistribution of wealth. There are people who oppose globalization on environmental grounds, justice, social justice grounds, gender grounds, all of these reasons. And there's certainly a dark side to globalization. The pandemic, of course, that it arrived because China's growing wealth, which was a product of globalization, has bumped up, its growth has bumped up against the biosphere with animals that where you have zoonotic diseases that spread and then spread to the world because the world is interlinked in a network of air transport. So dark side of globalization, absolutely. But that's, this is not necessarily the reason for opposing it. It is the reason for getting it right and improving. And by improving, I'd include the institutions, both the national and the international institutions that we have, including our economic institutions, were developed in their original forms following World War II, and they're all legacy institutions. So I think there's a huge question of that's where a huge question lies, in the sense that it's sort of free market capitalist ideas that have promoted and carried globalization forward, and it's the role of the government and government regulation that has lagged behind. And that I don't know if we're going to get into that, but that's a serious issue.
Yeah, and I think you'll probably get into it on, just to give a heads up, because you're going to do one of these great decisions, I believe, on trade investment, which obviously is directly related to globalization.
On supply chains and national security.
Thank you. We have an excellent comment here from David King, and I certainly agree with it. It says, "It seems to me that communications is as much a driver of globalization as anything else, especially in the pandemic-driven conditions we find ourselves in now. This Zoom-based discussion is an example of how technology-based communication can accelerate globalization." So what has happened? Trump has tried to turn back globalization, and the pandemic has accelerated globalization. I think that's probably true, and I think globalization is more based on communications and interconnection than anything else. Todd, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I do actually, and that's again, this helps take the idea of globalization out of its strictly economic definition, and there's no question that the information revolution that is having a transforming effect on human civilization, which you're absolutely right. Zoom is a technology that enables us to do that. So we are right this second participating in globalization. But some things to think about how it operates. And it's one is its extent. So using communication and information. So you have this extent of it. It spreads without reference to geography. We could be anywhere in the world. I'm in Amman, Jordan right now, and participating like I was right now. I could be next door. So it's that the extent of the interaction through communication, the intensity of our interaction. We just popped on in the middle, at the start of our week for an hour-long discussion about globalization. That's a pretty intense thing. And the only purpose is to be informed citizens. Anybody can do this and participate. Another dimension of it that the information and communications done has increased the velocity of globalization. And that's got good sides and bad sides, but the speed of change itself has increased. And sort of put those together and look at the impact of that globalization has had, like Vicky says, for example, in lifting, not just millions, but billions of people out of poverty in a really, really short time frame.
Okay, thank you. I'm delighted. Thank you, David and Stefan. Hope I'm going to get more. I'm going to read the third question. What does the next stage of globalization look like? Would we see more power ceded to international organizations? Does globalization have a future 20 years from now? So I'm still complaining about these questions. If globalization has had a future since World War II and perhaps before, then I don't think we're going to get out of this. Individually, we could try to be Henry David Thoreau and go to our little ponds and get away from our iPhones and our computers, but it probably will not last more than a month, 6 months, or a year. But the real issue there is, to me, what is the future of globalization right now? What should be the next steps? And I think that we face existential threats from nuclear proliferation, North Korea gaining a bomb in the missiles to the delivery systems, our difficulties with Russia. So nuclear is existential. Climate change is existential. We really need agreements on climate change that will protect us from the worst impacts of global change. And, we see global change even today, right in Texas, which has a bunch of snow, just like Santa Fe, but very seldom has that much snow. But we see also climate change and devastation, hurricanes and tsunamis and earthquakes, etc. And then gene manipulation. There's all sorts of reports about what China is doing with gene building an army of the future by manipulating characteristics of people who would be cultivated. I don't know how you say that, to be in the army. And then just internet regulation. To me, it doesn't make sense to allow someone like our former president to put lies out all over the internet and therefore be based pretty much on nothing but falsehoods. So rather than allowing a couple of business people to regulate the internet, I think we need rules in the United States and in general. What would you say to this question, Todd?
Yeah, I think that asking if globalization has a future is like asking, does the future have a future? It's kind of so. On that basis, what comes next? I think I agree with the thrust of what you're saying, Vicky. And I already mentioned this, that it's really not the economic free market economic dimension that needs to evolve, nor the technological, nor the this is a real age of entrepreneurial buccaneers. who are making, this is an amazing, last year was an amazing year for private space exploration, all those launches. That's all happening. The real next phase hinges on this question of international governance, by which I do not mean international government, this notion that the importance of nation states is declining, but rather the evolution of international institutions that must be the product and the expression of nation states. I don't know if that's clear, but sort of the President Biden's theme of America is back, assuming leadership, is very much tied to this idea of the United States government playing a role in shaping the world that we live in. And that means taking the international institutions that we have that not just regulate the economy, but there's nothing more important to global security architecture than the US Navy. But now we're adding to that a space command, a military command that is going to be operating in a defensive and offensive mode in our extraterrestrial environment. That absolutely is going to demand some form of regulation and rules, and only the state can provide that. That's my main reflection on where this is going.
Yeah, that's an excellent reflection, because I think, people don't like the idea of giving power to this global institution like the United Nations to interfere in the sovereignty of nations. But what I think the United Nations actually will move more and more toward, and it's what you're saying, is enforcement. The nation states decide on the agreements, and the United Nations enforces them. But there's still these separate governments, except in the case of like the EU and regional blocs that intentionally cede some of their sovereignty to each other. But in the case of the United Nations, what I like to point out is peacekeeping, probably because I'm an Africanist, and most of the peacekeeping just happens to be in Africa. And it's really important. I don't always think that the peacekeeping is terribly efficient, but the excellent thing about the peacekeeping is that the United States, its allies, have trained the militaries of African governments so that they can participate in these peacekeeping operations of the United Nations and the African Union. And in fact, the majority of the peacekeepers in Africa are Africans. So I think that for world peace, having international bodies that can provide peacekeeping and stability becomes extremely important. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, that reminded me of the sort of the political implications of globalization, the political dimension, and why, again, going back to the Biden administration, the new Biden administration, why I think it's very important to take what the president and all of the people on his foreign policy team say about democracy, and being very upfront from day one that we are in the world's democracies are in an ideological struggle against the rise of authoritarianism. And this is very directly tied to global stability and security. And this is the idea, Kant's idea of perpetual peace, which is that democracies tend not to attack each other. They tend much more to cooperate and to collaborate. And in fact, the idea, the concept of globalization on a political dimension and the issues that we're talking about absolutely depend on international cooperation. But it's not cooperation as determined by international organizations. It's cooperation among nation states, which embodies the idea of democracy.
And that's why we should be very concerned with the growing popularity and the desire of China to promote its system, authoritarian system, abroad and to other countries. And that's why the United States not looking very good recently, having an attack on its own institutions is dangerous in the long run to our own peace, prosperity, and stability. So the fourth question, and come on, people, you're supposed to be part of this. So ask your questions. The fourth question is, what are the biggest drawbacks to globalization? What are some ways governments can combat the drawback of globalization? Well, I think I already said income inequality in the United States is the greatest that it has ever, well, the greatest has been in 50 years. And so if people don't feel like they're secure, they have enough to eat, they have shelter, they can buy the things that they need, then they begin to blame it on, oh, free trade. It's all those goods coming into the United States and our inability to export, as Todd just mentioned. Trump's playing to this theme and trying to reinvigorate coal and manufacturing, things like that. So I think, globalization is going to continue, but for the United States to be an active player in globalization, we need a more equitable society. And I know Todd will have comments on this because he's been looking at it. That's part of the issue that Biden has said, that foreign policy must be based on domestic policy. In fact, his advisor, Jake Sullivan, has written a piece, Foreign Policy for the Middle Class. And that's why it's important that Americans have bought into and feel secure domestically, so that they understand foreign policy as contributing to their own as well as worldwide stability and prosperity. Todd?
So I think the big systemic drawback to globalization is exactly that. It is evolutionary in the sense that humanity as a whole benefits. It is, however, disruptive and even revolutionary for specific humans and groups of humans. And that can even apply to entire nations. And that the central question is, how does adaptation take place? I mean, if you take a Darwinian point of view, the fittest are the ones who will benefit the most. The fittest are the ones who will survive. In the American system, we have countered that by building in elements of a social welfare state that was consecutively or in parallel associated with a growing economy, so that the middle class was at the same time benefiting from employment, increases in wages, employment opportunities, and social security, and pension systems, and health insurance. So what you have now, essentially, we are extremely wealthy, seriously entitled as a nation. We believe we have a right to all of those things. So if you're in Appalachia and all this system is built around you mining coal, and as a result of the reduction in the demands for fossil fuel energy begin to squeeze out the least efficient sources of that energy, which happens to be coal, you are going to be pushed to the bottom of the bottom of that scale unless there are adaptive measures put in place. And that's the key challenge.
And here is a question that goes right along with it. I think people also can see it, but let me read it. I feel the Biden team is relying too much on the USA being able to create millions of jobs here through building climate change devices in the United States rather than importing such as solar panels and windmills, which is a really good point because free trade and free competition generally provides the cheapest and the best products. So perhaps we are relying too much on trying to build up U.S. industry in these areas. And I think another area we're working on doing the same is on protective gear for pandemics. Todd, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, but without drifting away from the idea of globalization, I think that there's this concept of the ESG economy. I don't know if any of you out there have heard of this, but it's the idea that the trade-off, the terms established in the capitalist system between growth and sustainability may be changing. And developments like the pandemic and climate change are accelerating those terms. And they hinge on ESG refers to environment, social, and governance issues. Looking to the future, I think that you see the corporate sector that is required to think long term about these issues is already pricing that in to their decision making. And there was the classic case, it was just so clear cut and classic, occurred at the end of the Trump administration when they approved the auction for the Arctic wildlife refuge, and it was a complete failure. Why did this supposedly great boon to the petroleum industry of opening up this protected area for drilling and exploration and drilling, why did it fail? It wasn't because of the pressure of environmental groups, although that was a factor. It certainly wasn't a social dimension because Alaskans by and large wanted to benefit from it. It was the fact that none of the oil majors entered a bid. The large banks had already said they were not going to issue any financing for oil exploration in the wildlife refuge, and insurance companies were not going to underwrite exploration. That's a pretty powerful statement about the direction that the economy is moving, and is very much part and parcel of globalization.
That very, very good example on the Arctic wilderness. I loved it. I thought that was just the way it should happen, with the banks and the insurance companies saying, we don't want to be responsible for this. We have a question from Teresa Ortiz, and she says, digital literacy and uncensored access seem to be paramount in support of individual and business participation in globalization. It would seem that countries having uncensored access to the internet will be most successful in embracing the revolutionary aspects of globalization. What must happen in countries under censored internet access and low digital literacy skills due to what should they do to participate in globalization? That's assuming, that is assuming, Teresa, that they want to. I mean, China obviously is a huge global player in investment. It's the biggest investor in infrastructure in Africa, but China is not pushing global access to internet with the Uyghurs or with even in Hong Kong. So you have this really interesting division between countries that clearly are major global players, but at the same time are limiting their citizenry's access to the free flow of information. Todd, do you want to speak to that a little bit as well?
Yeah, I think, we're accustomed to thinking, sort of ranking countries and thinking about them in terms of free versus unfree. But you can go along and just adjust that a little bit and think about them in terms of open versus closed. And to really achieve, I would, on that basis, to really achieve the goals and the benefits of globalization, that it implies a dedication to openness. So every time there was a measure taken to close that off, or to censor, if you want to use that, you're limiting that factor. But as far as literacy goes, something that really surprised me when I was in Afghanistan, sort of convinced me that was not going to be a problem. That was going to shake itself out. And it was the fact that you could go just about anywhere in one of the most war-torn, isolated, in some ways backwards countries, if you want to think about the conservative Southern Pashtun Islamists. They all have cell phones, and they all text, and they're all on that, using those all the time. Not only that, Afghanistan is thoroughly integrated into the global market in a way that it sort of epitomizes globalization. The only problem is, of course, that they produce 90% of the world's opium. So what they're feeding is the mostly Western countries and Middle Eastern countries heroin addictions. But this issue of open versus closed, again, takes me back to the theme of democracy. That thinking about where this is going, I would say that we are emerging, or we should be doing a better job of emerging out of the era of unfettered information entrepreneurship, sort of the buccaneer era. And that's where the role of the state comes in, which is what we're seeing going on with all these hearings and the cases against the big five information companies. This is also the direction that this is going in. So it's not the same as censorship. Without some form of collaborative arrangement among states to regulate information, I don't think it's going to be able to evolve beyond where it is now.
Thank you, Ambassador Gomez. Thank you for intervening again. Your point is really great. He says if globalization is to be sustainable, it should avoid leading to excessive dependence on one particular provider. That makes us think about the oil pipeline from Russia to Germany, be it electronic components, the United States, or rare earth minerals, China. Thus, some degree of autonomy, of self-sufficiency seems to be desirable. And I think that's a really excellent point, and one that, has to be worked into globalization as we move ahead. The United States used to comment more on this, Todd, have a strategic oil reserve, because that was important to our own survival. now we have so much oil, we are depressing to some extent the oil market. Yes, I think in some areas, nation states have to be sure and provide for very important issues or very important products. Philippa Klessig says she agrees with Stefan. Doesn't globalization mean we stop trying to do everything here? Climate change devices could be built worldwide, and shared technology should be an example. Absolutely. Todd, do you want to comment on Philippa's?
Yes, I agree that the point about the need to have some degree of self-sufficiency gets, it's really the pandemic that's brought this home. The dependence on manufacturers of testing reagents, the personal protective equipment, ventilators, all these things have been enormous sources of sort of beggar thy neighbor competition, but does imply the need to have a certain national basis ability to produce things that are not just determined by free market forces, low wages, and other elements of comparative advantage. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you're transforming your whole notion of national security. What does security really mean? And it ties very much to the idea I was talking about before, the trade-off between the capitalist impetus for growth and sustainability. And here we're talking about security and sustainability for national populations. That means that if you're paying higher manufacturing or labor rates for certain portions of the economy, then that you because you value that in and of itself, then you're willing to make that investment at a higher cost. That does make sense.
Teresa just commented that, so the common people are not globalized, but used as a commodity by their government to participate in globalization. I guess you would say that's what China is doing with the Uyghurs. But
every time you step foot in Walmart and buy something, you're participating in globalization.
Yeah.
Right. If you have if you have your Chevy truck and you're out there driving it, the parts in that truck are going to come from a dozen different countries.
And I think maybe these countries that suppress part of their population do themselves in the end a disservice. I mean, they may keep the ruling government in power, but in fact, they don't reach their full potential because they're not taking advantage of the cultures, of the languages, and of the abilities of all the people in the cultures. And that's one reason the United States needs to do a lot better on its inequality index and address that so that people have more of an opportunity to participate and benefit from globalization. So last question, and most of it we've already discussed. Which nation is the leader of the globalization movement? Why is it? And can they find a way to make it more appealing to the global masses? So yes, it's the United States. And we've sort of not been there as much as we should have been, at least in our alliances and supporting our allies, as we should have been. We're now returning to it. And since President Biden is connecting it to our domestic revival as well, I think that we will once again be seen as a leader, and America, as Biden says, will be back. But one of the things the United States has to do is to live up to the things it says in the OECD, the Economic Organization. 37 countries who are more or less the developed countries of the world. The United States is in the bottom fourth of giving aid on a percentage basis. We're the leader in giving aid overall because of our strong economy. But if we put it on a percentage basis, then it's Denmark, UK, Sweden, Norway, Luxembourg, and France that are in the upper third. So we have to live up to some of these things that we're trying to lead the world in. Todd?
Yeah, just two quick points. One, I think that China, if you asked someone in China, they would say they are the leaders of globalization. It just happens that they're pursuing a very different vision of what that means, and there's a lot of importance to be taken from that. Second point, this question of what is it, and can they find a way to make it more appealing to the global masses? It what? I don't get that question, because one way to get at that is take a look at surveys. Globalization skeptics are predominant in industrialized countries, and if you look at public opinion surveys, majorities of countries that are in the process of development support globalization. They don't have the problems that we do, thinking, worrying over whether it's a good or a bad thing.
I think that we've about come to the end of this discussion. But one of the most important points that we haven't really spoken about, maybe you want to jump in too on this, Todd, is migration. The more there's globalization and the more countries around the world can benefit from globalization by jobs, investment being global, the less issues we're going to have with migration. People leave the countries they're in not only because of persecution, but principally for economic opportunity. And so if globalization is going to succeed for all, then that's one of the most important reasons why we need to promote rule-based international system, free investment, attempt to reduce corruption, which completely skews the use of resources worldwide. Todd?
So, well, of course, when it comes to migration, immigration, one of the aggressive countries is the United States. And this is not just the Trump xenophobic anti-immigrant stuff. It is the fact that we have on the order of 12 million people in the United States who don't have legal status. But if you're thinking globalization, a large majority of them would be just as happy to flow back and forth to Mexico and Central America. They just can't, because they're not allowed to, because the risks are too high. But the demand for labor, particularly in construction and agriculture, is so high that they find jobs here. This is ridiculous that we have not been able to set the rules in our own country for political reasons since 1986, since Ronald Reagan was president. Now, if Trump and Stephen Miller and all those crowd were able to get rid of all these horrible foreigners and then put up a wall and keep them out, we would be paying double for our houses. And who wants to buy a $7 head of lettuce? it's kind of the logic of globalization. It's sort of this whole idea of, is there a future for globalization? Well, it's not really it's not like there's an option. It's a good one.
And then if we, just a brief comment on that, if we were willing to put more assistance into Central America rather than less, then we likely would have less migration. But I always like to point out that actually what happened in Central America, or one of the things that happened, is the United States policy of sending back to Central America young people who had committed crimes and misdemeanors, and they returned to those countries not even speaking the language, but they were proficient enough to start gangs. And so much of the violence in Central America actually came from youth that the United States sent back to those countries. So sometimes we can't just blame other countries for what has occurred domestically. But I agree 100% with Todd. Ideally, we would have free countries would control their borders, but it would be relatively free so that people could flow in and out and make money in one country and then return to their own country. I like to remind people that 1 million Americans live in Mexico. So if we start deporting Mexicans, I wonder if perhaps Mexicans will then deport Americans, but that's probably not possible given that the Americans provide a lot of wealth. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this session on globalization and have a good idea of its background and its future. And again, Todd, thank you so much for joining me. It's made it a most interesting program. And Stefan, it was great to have you join us and provide your good questions, as well as to the audience in general. I appreciate very much your questions. It makes it a much more interesting program. Thank you all.
Okay, always a pleasure, Vicki. And I will be seeing everyone that's participating in Great Decisions for a couple more sessions here in the future.
Thank you both so much. Great pleasure. And I hope to see many of you here on Thursday when we go down to Mexico. Goodbye, everybody.